the law that forced criminals to babysit their victims. Imagine a world where instead of sitting in a prison cell, a thief had to work for the family they robbed. Picture a vandal being forced to repair the damage they caused while facing their victim every single day. This isn't a fantasy, it's actually happened throughout history, and some of these practices continue today. Welcome to the fascinating world of restorative justice, where criminals don't just pay their debt to society, they pay it directly to the people they harm. Long before modern prison systems existed, communities had to deal with crime in more direct ways. In ancient societies, when someone committed a crime, they couldn't simply be locked away and forgotten about. Resources were too precious, and communities were too small to lose productive members to incarceration. The Code of Hammurabi, dating back to 1750 BCE, established some of the first written laws that required criminals to make direct amends to their victims. If you stole someone's ox, you didn't just get punished, you had to replace it, often with multiple oxen as compensation. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about making the victim whole again. In medieval Europe, a system called Wergild required criminals to pay compensation directly to victims or their families. The amount varied based on the severity of the crime and the social status of the victim. A nobleman's injury cost more to compensate than a peasant's, but the principle remained the same: the criminal had to face the consequences of their actions directly. Perhaps nowhere is restorative justice more deeply embedded than in indigenous communities around the world. For thousands of years, Native American tribes, Aboriginal Australians, and other indigenous peoples have used healing circles and similar practices to address crime and conflict. When a member of the community committed a crime, they weren't banished or imprisoned. Instead, they were brought before a circle that included the victim, community elders, family members, and the offender themselves. The goal wasn't punishment for its own sake, but healing for everyone involved. The offender would have to face their victim directly, listen to how their actions affected not just the individual, but the entire community. Then, they would work to make amends, sometimes through direct service to the victim, sometimes through community service, and always through a commitment to change their behavior. In 1989, New Zealand revolutionized its approach to juvenile crime with the Children, Young Persons, and Their Families Act. This law mandated that whenever possible, young offenders should meet face-to-face with their victims in what became known as family group conferences. Picture this scenario. A teenager breaks into an elderly woman's home and steals her jewelry. Under traditional justice, the teen might serve a few months in juvenile detention and never understand the real impact of their crime. But in New Zealand's system, that teenager sits across from the elderly woman in a facilitated meeting. The woman doesn't just talk about the missing jewelry. She talks about how she no longer feels safe in her own home. She talks about the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the way the crime shattered her sense of security. For many offenders, this is the first time they truly understand that their victims are real people with real feelings. But the process doesn't stop there. The teenager might be required to work to pay for new locks, security systems, or replacement jewelry. They might have to check in on the elderly woman regularly, helping with yard work or grocery shopping. In essence, they become responsible for helping to rebuild what they destroy. The results of these programs have been remarkable. In New Zealand, reoffending rates among young people dropped significantly after implementing restorative justice practices. But perhaps more importantly, victim satisfaction rates soared. Consider the case of Sarah, whose car was stolen by a group of teenagers for a joyride. Instead of simply seeing them sentenced to community service, Sarah chose to meet with them through a restorative justice conference. During the meeting, she learned that one of the teens had been trying to impress his friends, while another was struggling with family problems at home. The teenagers were required to pay for the damage to Sarah's car, but they also had to understand the full impact of their crime. Sarah explained how she had saved for 2 years to buy that car, how she needed it to get to work, and how their actions had jeopardized her livelihood. The outcome was transformative. The teenagers not only repaired the damage but maintained a relationship with Sarah for years afterward. One even credited the experience with turning his life around completely. What makes restorative justice so powerful is its psychological impact on both victims and offenders. Traditional justice systems often leave victims feeling powerless and forgotten. They may never learn why they were targeted or see any meaningful consequences for the person who harmed them. But when criminals are forced to face their victims directly, something profound happens. The victim regains their voice and their power. They can ask the questions that have been haunting them. Why me? Do you understand what you put me through? How are you going to make this right? For offenders, the experience is often life-changing. It's much easier to steal from an abstract concept of society than from Mrs. Johnson next door who baked cookies for your school fundraiser. When criminals see their victims as real people with real lives, it becomes much harder to justify their actions. Of course, restorative justice isn't without its critics and challenges. Some argue that it's too soft on criminals, that some offenses are too serious for this approach. There are legitimate concerns about ensuring victim safety and preventing re-traumatization. Not all victims want to meet their offenders, and they shouldn't be forced to. The process only works when all parties participate willingly. There are also questions about how to handle repeat offenders, or those who show no genuine remorse. Today, restorative justice practices are spreading worldwide. Countries like Canada, Australia, and parts of the United States have implemented similar programs. Some focus on juvenile offenders, while others include adults for certain types of crimes. Technology has even enabled new forms of restorative justice. Video conferences allow victims and offenders to meet safely across distances. Online platforms help facilitate ongoing communication and accountability. The concept of forcing criminals to babysit their victims might sound unusual, but it represents a return to a more human approach to justice. Instead of simply punishing wrongdoing, these systems focus on healing, understanding, and preventing future crimes. As we face rising crime rates and overcrowded prisons in many parts of the world, perhaps it's time to look back at these ancient wisdoms and modern innovations. Justice doesn't always have to be about locking people away. Sometimes it's about bringing people together to heal the wounds that crime creates. The law that forced criminals to face their victims wasn't about cruelty, it was about humanity. And in our increasingly disconnected world, maybe that's exactly the kind of justice we need.